What's up YouTube? I recently hopped on the bandwagon and quit WoW in favor of Final Fantasy, so I wanted to give my own comparison of the two games from a noob's perspective. I'd like to preface this by stating that everything I say in this video is my opinion of what I like and dislike between both games, and is in no means the gospel truth, nor is this a review, so please don't mistake it for one. I also want to make it crystal clear that the recent news regarding Blizzard is in no way, shape, or form going to influence or give bias to any of my opinions, and I'm strictly going to be focusing on the games, not the media surrounding them. I recommend you take everything I say with a grain of salt and try out both games for yourself before you decide what you like more. If you don't feel like watching the whole video, then the TLDW is that I would highly recommend Final Fantasy over WoW in its current Shadowlands patch 9.1 state. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the leveling experience, and I'm actually pretty mixed on this. As a quick disclaimer, I have 2 level 60 characters in Shadowlands, but only 1 level 30 Lancer in Final Fantasy, so I can't speak to the full leveling experience in Final Fantasy, but I feel like I've gotten the gist of it. The biggest and most important difference to me is that WoW content is scaled and Final Fantasy content is not. I highly prefer scaled leveling over the traditional style of leveling because in my opinion, it gives each player a more unique experience and it helps to keep the content fresh for longer. For example, in WoW, I leveled my first character through Battle for Azeroth. On my second character, however, I decided to jump around a little bit and level in Warlords of Draenor, Legion, and BFA, simply because I had the freedom to do so. It kept the game interesting for me because I was doing an entirely new set of quests at my own pace and at whatever level I desired instead of slogging through the same quest I've already done or being forced to go through zones that I didn't enjoy running through the first time around. In Final Fantasy, however, the experience differs quite a bit, but I've still thoroughly enjoyed it. My favorite part of leveling so far has been the main stage quest progression. I love how you can level your character for the most part through the main story quest. To me, that's a big deal because in the vast majority of MMOs, you're forced to push through heinous amounts of side quests to reach the correct level in order to progress further. In Final Fantasy, I've only had to do a handful of side quests in order to progress to the next stage of my MSQ or my class quest. But I do think that there is a negative that comes with that. To me, it makes the game feel more linear and like it offers less freedom. It feels like I'm being forced to follow a set path if I'd like to maintain a consistent leveling experience because the side quest I completed didn't feel rewarding enough compared to just doing the story quest. I felt like my time was being wasted and I was getting nothing in return for doing the side quest. Overall though, the quests have been a lot more fun and interesting than WoW's because it feels like my character is actually impacting the world with every single quest that I do. If Final Fantasy had more freedom with its leveling, I would hands down give it a point over WoW, but for now I just call it a tie. The next point I'd like to talk about is the combat and skills. I'm grouping these two together because I think they go hand in hand. Final Fantasy has absolutely exceeded my expectations and I firmly believe that it blows WoW out of the water in this category. The combat experience in Final Fantasy wins by far simply because of how streamlined it is compared to WoW. In Final Fantasy there is no talent tree or skill points, and these are by no means bad things in an MMO, but the way they're implemented in WoW is unacceptable in my opinion. In Final Fantasy, your class is given all the tools necessary to succeed. You don't have to worry about picking this passive over this passive or picking this skill over this skill in your talent tree in order to be successful. Everybody's on an equal playing field and it's up to the player to utilize their skill set to its fullest extent. You aren't forced to pick between fun and performance because every class can have both if the player is competent. I absolutely fucking love how combos work in Final Fantasy. It just feels so incredibly rewarding to me knowing that I can consistently pump out extreme damage just by learning my class and utilizing my combos properly. WoW, however, is a train wreck compared to this. In WoW, I constantly feel like I'm praying to the RNG gods to bless me with the critical hit or even just enough mana to allow me to actually attack. There is so much downtime in WoW and hoping and praying that your passives proc so you can pull off an insane combo. The combat experience is by far more rewarding and enjoyable in Final Fantasy because it feels like I'm actually in control of my character's power and I can utilize that power to its full potential. Next up is the class system, and unfortunately not much can be said about this as it's pretty basic and doesn't go into much detail. In WoW, you make a character, you pick a class, and you play a spec. Some classes like Paladin can be a tank, DPS, or healer spec, whereas others like Hunter can only play DPS. There isn't anything inherently wrong with this system, but keep in mind that Blizzard is god-awful at balancing. You're most likely going to reach a point in the game where you need to play a class or spec that puts up better numbers, rather than the one you enjoy playing. In Final Fantasy, one character can play every class in the game just by simply changing their weapon. The classes aren't as fleshed out as they are in WoW, as discussed earlier in the combat and skill section, but having the freedom of playing a new class without starting from scratch is an absolute godsend. At the end of the day though, it just depends on what you prefer, as neither of these systems are bad, especially considering that most people only focus on one class at a time anyway. Now before I get into my final major point, I'd like to say that I can't speak on endgame yet because obviously I haven't reached endgame in Final Fantasy. I do have my opinions on WoW endgame, but I won't get into that just because it wouldn't really be a comparison video if I didn't have anything to compare it to. I'd also like to bring up some less important topics that really shouldn't influence your decision but should be spoken of regardless. The first topic is transmog. The transmog in WoW is incredibly simplified, and the general consensus amongst the communities is that it's far superior to Final Fantasy. There's more armor options, although you could argue that they aren't as high quality as Final Fantasy, and it's as simple as visiting a special NPC, picking a style, and applying it with gold. Final Fantasy, however, is a bit more complicated. First, you have to complete a quest, and then you have to acquire special consumable reagents that must be used for every piece of equipment you transmog, and this isn't a deal breaker, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. So the next minor topic I want to talk about is mounts. Simply put, mounts in Final Fantasy are much more sparse and are not as easily collectible and attainable as mounts in WoW. I love how easy it is to acquire mounts in WoW. You simply get an achievement, kill a monster, or complete a quest. Now for my final point, and if nothing else was enough to convince you to give Final Fantasy a shot, hopefully this will. The community is absolutely phenomenal. In my first day of playing Final Fantasy, I was greeted by a player who offered me food that buffed my stats and even gave me an XP bonus, and my first dungeon boss was a breeze because of helpful teammates. Not to exaggerate, but I've had more positive experiences in my 12 hours of Final Fantasy than in 300 hours of WoW. Now that's not to say that Final Fantasy can't be toxic, because just like any online game, it can and will be. But overall, my experience has been far more positive than my time in WoW. So that's all I have to say. I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope I was informative, and if I said anything stupid or wrong, please feel free to correct me. You know, I'd like to be here for the long run, and I'm definitely willing to learn from the veteran members of the community. So until next time, peace.